Hi, would you do me a small favor and look at your screen right now and tell me, what color do you see in the middle here? Don't overthink it, it's not a trick question, and yes, you did click on a music video. Just bear with me. So, I think we can all agree this is the color green, right? But have you ever wondered, do you see the same thing as me? Yes, we all acknowledge that this thing is called green, and scientifically, colors are indeed measurable frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum, much in the way that sounds are measurable frequencies on the audio spectrum. But those signals are decoded by our brains, and there's no true way of telling whether your green is the same as my green. Likewise, in the audio domain, there is no true way of telling whether what you hear is the same as what anyone else hears. So you might be able to see where I'm going with this. Most mixing tutorials have a fundamental flaw. They have to assume that your green is the same as their green, be it through your monitoring environment, your ear education, or your experience. Would it be the same? These things are all based on the presumption that you can hear what they can hear, which, when you think about it, is quite unlikely. One of you once messaged me on Instagram not too long ago with what on paper seemed like a great idea. They asked, please release a pre-mixed drum rack. Sounds like something that could save you a lot of time, right? But my response was this: how could I? I haven't heard your track. For you see, mixing is entirely contextual. Like all musical skills, it's one small part of a bigger picture. To bring this back to the visual analogy, take a look at these orange squares inside the rectangle. You know what I'm going to say, right? Yes, they're all the same shade of orange. All 6 of them. I'll link a video below proving it. It's an optical illusion. Your brain decodes things differently in different contexts. And it's no different with audio. You may have heard me use the word psychoacoustics in some of my other videos. Well, psychoacoustics is just the perception of sound. In other words, what our brain perceives versus what is actually measured. Psychoacoustics are to our ears what optical illusions are to our eyes. I can almost guarantee that new magical vocal EQ trick you just learned came without an iota of context. Because just like those orange squares, that same vocal next to a snare, or hi-hat, or lead sound, or pad is going to sound completely different in every context. This is Lucy. She's a new producer. She's just learnt that new magical vocal EQ trick. She's excited. She has a new string to her bow, or a new tool for the toolbox, shall we say. It's a shiny new hammer, and excited to try it? Right now, every vocal looks like a nail. Because unfortunately, Lucy doesn't have the same ear education or experience as the person who taught her this new trick. Nor has she been taught any context to where this new trick would actually be appropriate to use. So she's going to hammer every vocal and then wonder in confusion and frustration at why this new trick does not translate to the same results shown in the tutorial. We've all been there, right? You watch a tutorial that tells you can get a nice airy vocal sound by boosting at 10 kilohertz or something. I remember some of my earliest naive internet searches were things like Prodigy synth EQ settings. But of course, I didn't have the same synth as the Prodigy. And that vocal you're trying to add air to doesn't have any air to bring out at 10K. It might be 2K. Or the performance itself might not have any air at all to bring out. So all you end up with is nasty sibilance. This is the reason EQ presets, and indeed compression presets, can never work. However, you can't hear that nasty sibilance because you don't yet have the ear training. So you apply the magic EQ settings anyway, because you have been told that is what you should do. Ergo, there lies our paradox. If these tutorials are not helpful to those without ear education, and those with ear education no longer need these tutorials, what is the purpose of these tutorials? Look at this gear. Phew. That brushed steel surface set inside the tasteful oak wood grain housing, that gentle orange underglow from the incandescent bulb inside the VU meter, big gain knob. And this one is free. Why wouldn't you want to slap one of those on every track? That's surely going to make your track better, right? Or at the other end of the spectrum, what if that gear you just bought was the opposite of free? What if you just spent £2,000 on it? You bet that's going to get used on lots of tracks. Look, I'm not mocking anyone. We all suffer from the temptations of gear porn. Be it hardware or software, it's another one of these compounding factors to the vicious circle of your progress. Because you don't yet have the experience, ear education, or context to recognize the problem in the first place, it makes total sense that the solution would lie in that brand new shiny box thrust in your face by some social media influencer who has conveniently omitted to tell you that they make more from their YouTube sponsorships than from their actual music. And speaking of gear, many of these tutorials that feature it go about it in such a way that would insinuate that the gear you already have isn't up to task. They talk in exactly the same way as tutorials from 20 years ago, as if you have your first copy of Cubase and only its internal plugins. Back then, there was a marked difference between a UAD EQ and your DAW's stock EQ. In fact, companies like Waves made their name in this day because computer power was at a premium, and your DAW's internal processors had to cut many quality corners just to be able to run enough for one per track. For most of us, the computer was there to record the sound only. It could not afford to process it. For processing, we had to rely on outboard gear, external processors. Companies like Waves came along with the first quality software options, at the expense of your CPU power, of course. So we only ran these on the important tracks, like the vocal. If you wanted to run more, you had to purchase extra help. Hybrid software-hardware solutions appeared in the early 2000s in the form of various DSP cards, basically mini computers that you put inside your main computer to run the effects so the main CPU was not burdened. Pro Tools had their TDM chips, Universal Audio had the UAD system, TC Electronics had the Power Core system. And yes, they were expensive. If you could get them running, that is. Only certain motherboards could handle the bandwidth, and if your audio interface or sound card conflicted with one of the addresses, you were out of luck. Why am I on this nostalgia train? Well, because in the last 2 decades, your phone now has more power than those computers. Any DAW you choose to use and its stock plugins are far past where we were then. As Dan Worrell already brilliantly said, you already have all the tools you need. Use them. Don't blame them. One of the most common questions I get from my viewers is, why don't you use compression? And the answer is, I do, but I only use it on things that need compressing. So this is a classic example of the hammer and nail phenomena. You were applying compression because you were told it was the done thing. Those of you asking that question just simply don't have the ear education yet to recognize dynamics in audio. In the context of dance production, where our sources come from pre-made samples or electronic instruments like synths and drum machines, a good 95% of those sounds do not require any compression. Okay, so I can't pass on my experience or ear education, but I can help you with a little bit of historical context. For example, compression. Let me give you a brief history of compression. German company Telefunken brought compression to the world in the 1930s, nearly 100 years ago today. Its initial use being to tame the volume spikes of radio presenters' voices, much like I am doing here today. It was quickly adopted for radio transmission too, where FM radio had just been invented. FM radio is transmitted over a quite limited bandwidth, so being able to squeeze a signal into that bandwidth could help prevent something called overmodulation. Naturally, this technology moved over to recording studios, which had their own bandwidth worries. Mixing desks, tape, and vinyl all suffering from their own bandwidth limitations, which could easily be exceeded by acoustic instruments like drums, brass, or even vocals. Record too loud, you got distortion. Record too quiet, you got lots of hiss and noise. So compressors were used to tame the dynamic range of those acoustic instruments to keep the signal within the operating range of those mediums. And artistic techniques like the so-called glue compression. These are also notions from the world of real bands and acoustic recordings. When you have 16 microphones on a drum kit, each with a ridiculous dynamic range, and needing to sound like one whole, bus compression or glue compression can help with that. Fast forward to today, we still actually have some bandwidth limitations, but your typical home studio, laptop, whatever, has double the operating range of any $1 million studio of those days. And we don't have the concerns of tape or vinyl anymore, not as our only final mastering medium anyway. And I'll put a large bet on most of my viewers not having to deal with many real acoustic recordings either. For the few of you out there actually making your own recordings, it's probably a vocal, at which point you will probably find that recording is indeed quite spiky and will need compression. If, however, you are the other 94% of us, finding vocals or other acoustic samples via services like Splice or LoopCloud, you will find most of those are already heavily compressed in an effort to impress you and hopefully make you pick them. As for non-acoustic sources, synthesizers and drum samples, for example, these do not contain anywhere near a fraction of the dynamic range of their acoustic equivalents. Trying to reduce the dynamic range of something that has no dynamic range will usually result in a mushy, dull, flat mess. So why do all these tutorials tell you to apply compression to things like your electronic snare drums? It's simply because they were told to. At some point in history, an acoustic engineer passed that tip on to an electronic engineer who did not have the ear education to appreciate its context. Thus, we end up with the blind leading the blind situation, or should I say the deaf leading the deaf. Now, don't get me wrong, compression can be used to enhance a sound in many ways, but it comes back down to the ear education paradox. In the hands of a newcomer, it's much more likely to cause more damage than good. Thus, I typically rarely recommend it. And as I show in my own music, and the many tracks I've made for others, it's absolutely not necessary. As many of you know, I created this channel to focus a little more on the music side than the engineering side, as there were lots of YouTube channels talking about how to make your music sound better, but not so many talking about the actual music. Possibly as many see musicianship as more of a dark art than engineering. However, you could argue this as the opposite way round. Music is actually quite mathematical. We use a 12-note system in the West. We only usually use 7 of those 12 notes. And even rhythmically, we base that on a grid of 16. And that's not just a human construct. In nature, the pitch of sound is very mathematical. What sounds we deem pleasant together happen to have very simple mathematical ratios, like double or half. Whereas engineering, not so much. Considering how scientific most of this approach looks, it turns out when it comes to a mix, there are no right answers. Only can you serve the message or emotion of the track. You'll often hear me advise reference. Well, this is one of the reasons why. Just pull together any 5 popular references into your DAW, and you'll soon find out how wide the ballpark actually is. Especially if those references are from different artists. you'll likely find that tracks that have been just as successful as one another sound very different from one another. So why are we always looking for these definitive answers? One reason, I believe, is the school system. Anyone who is educated in the West has been conditioned to memorize correct answers. But this is art. There are no correct answers. Take the pressure off yourself. Okay, so that's a lot of naysaying. Let's wrap this up with some positivity and practical advice. So, please know that if you are starting your music production journey in this day and age, you are in a tremendously privileged position. You could not pick a better time. The stock gear is amazing. You have internet access. You have free distribution to the entire world. We are at the stage where more successful engineers than me, like Chris Basford, are telling you if you need top end, reach for any plugin that gives you top end. It no longer matters which one. These days, the only thing between you and your dream sound is time. In that time, I personally suggest you practice by trying to recreate your favorite tracks, referencing a lot. Swap your priorities from engineering to earlier in the process. Practice your sound selection, your writing, and your arrangements. Because if you get those right first, you won't have to mix. And remember, a great track that's mixed badly will always do better than a bad track that's mixed well. So, don't overthink this engineering stuff. The goal, like all aspects of music, is to convey the emotion of the track, nothing more. Next time you're watching a mix tutorial, ask yourself, is this giving me the emotional results I am looking for? Has the context been explained? And is the principle applicable to gear I already own? If not, take it with a large pinch of salt. If you want my personal recommendations, I recommend Dan Worrell and Gregory Scott over at the House of Kush. And if you were ever to read just one book, check out Mastering Audio by Bobcats. They are not focused on electronic dance music. However, for general no BS engineering advice, I thoroughly recommend them. Right then, well, if you made it this far, my extra thanks. Be sure to check out the description for all the relevant links. And until next week, I'll see you in the comments. Bye-bye.